It gives me great pleasure to read to you today my Emancipation Proclamation, issued on January 1st, 1863, in the midst of our great and terrible Civil War. I shall skip over the beginning section, which refers back to my preliminary proclamation of the previous September 22nd, in which I advised the rebelling states of my intention to declare forever free all those persons held as slaves in those states and parts of states still in rebellion. I then proclaimed, "Now therefore I, Abraham Lincoln, President of the United States, by virtue of the power in me vested as Commander-in-Chief of the Army and Navy of the United States, in time of actual armed rebellion against the authority and government of the United States, and as a fit and necessary war measure for suppressing said rebellion, do, on this first day of January, in the year of our Lord 1863, and in accordance with my purpose so to do, publicly proclaim, for the full period of 100 days, from the day first above mentioned, order and designate as the states and parts of states wherein the people thereof respectively are this day in rebellion against the United States, the following, to wit." I then listed those states and parts of states which were still in rebellion and to which the proclamation would apply. I then continued, "And by virtue of the power, and for the purpose aforesaid, I do order and declare that all persons held as slaves within said designated states and parts of states are, and henceforward shall be, free, and that the executive government of the United States, including the military and naval authorities thereof, will recognize and maintain the freedom of said persons. And I hereby enjoin upon the people so declared to be free to abstain from all violence, unless in necessary self-defense, and I recommend to them that in all cases when allowed, they labor faithfully for reasonable wages. And I further declare and make known that such persons of suitable condition will be received into the armed service of the United States to garrison forts, positions, stations, and other places, and to man vessels of all sorts in said service. And upon this act, sincerely believed to be an act of justice, warranted by the Constitution, upon military necessity, I invoke the considerate judgment of mankind and the gracious favor of Almighty God. In witness whereof, I have hereunto set my hand and caused the seal of the United States to be affixed, done at the city of Washington, this first day of January, in the year of our Lord 1863, and of the independence of the United States of America, the 87th. Thus ended my proclamation. I am very pleased to learn that 157 years later, it is still the considerate judgment of mankind that it truly was an act of justice and has received the gracious favor of Almighty God.
Hello, library friends. My name is Juanta Griffin, and I'm the Multicultural Learning Coordinator of the Oak Park Public Library, and today we're going to discuss Juneteenth. Juneteenth is the oldest nationally celebrated commemoration of the ending of slavery in the United States. It dates back to June 19th, 1865. It is also known as Freedom Day, Jubilee Day, and Emancipation Day. Recently, it's been referred to as Black Independence Day. But what is it? Most people believe that slavery ended January 1st, 1863, when President Abraham Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation. But they would be wrong. Word of slavery ending traveled slowly, especially in remote areas. This was the case in Texas, where thousands of enslaved Black people continued to suffer and toil for nearly 3 years after the Emancipation Proclamation. General Gordon Granger arrived in Galveston, Texas. He issued an order officially decreeing freedom and announcing that the end of the Civil War on June 19, 1865, hence the term Juneteenth. Upon hearing the news of freedom, the first response of many formerly enslaved Black people was the desire to reach out to families. So they settled in places like Louisiana, Arkansas, and Oklahoma. Juneteenth festivities include rodeos, fishing, barbecuing, and baseball, much like the family reunions we experience today and the ever-popular cookout. Juneteenth celebrations are always focused on education and self-improvement. Often guest speakers, pastors, elders are called upon to recount events of the past and plan for the future of the community. Prayer services are also a major part of Juneteenth celebrations. I'm Juanta Griffin, and how will you celebrate Juneteenth?
Back in February 2020, the Forest Park Juneteenth Committee was beginning to plan their 12th annual Jubilee Pool Party, where families come together to celebrate freedom and their shared hopes for a better tomorrow. By March, however, the whole world found itself in the middle of the COVID-19 pandemic, so the pool party was canceled. And by May 26, with Juneteenth less than a month away, protests began to fuel a worldwide movement when the death of George Floyd sparked a fire aimed at burning down systemic racism and police brutality as brave citizens, young and old, began to reimagine a world where all men are truly created equal. Recognizing the moment, the Juneteenth Planning Committee decided that they needed to create a space to have some long overdue conversations about America, race, Juneteenth, and our shared hopes for a better tomorrow.
As a young boy, Juneteenth was really not that important to me. It was something that we did every year. I looked forward to it because it gave me a chance to drink all the grape, orange, and strawberry soda water I wanted to in one setting. And we also enjoyed the parade. But as a grown-up, as someone who had moved away from the state of Texas, I think as part of missing my family, I also missed the tradition of Juneteenth. And then finally, as a parent, I think it's a tradition that I wanted to share with my children. When I became an elected official in Forest Park, I felt like as a leader of color, it was up to me to establish a tradition for the community in Forest Park where our children could enjoy an event. It did not have to be exclusively for children of color, but I wanted it at least to be predominantly participated in by children of color. And June is a summer event, and I felt like it was an adequate time for an event. And like I said, Juneteenth was something natural to me, and that's why we chose to have it at the park. And then also there's the tradition of pools in the country. Public swimming pools were some of the last places to be integrated. So I thought it would be a powerful symbol to have a Juneteenth event at the Forest Park Aquatic Center.
My mother was one of the greatest cooks that ever walked inside of the kitchen. And so we'd look forward to the Juneteenth celebration because it was going to be a sumptuous meal, and we'd learn a little bit about why they would tell us that Juneteenth was really the Independence Day for all of the African Americans who were enslaved at that time.
So the interesting thing about celebrating Juneteenth is that I really don't think that a lot of white people know what it is. I certainly didn't know what it was until, I met my friend and neighbor who invited me to a pool party, I don't know, 6-7 years ago. I hadn't heard of it. I did not know what it meant, the significance behind it. So the celebration aspect of it, at least how we've done it here in Forest Park, has been bringing people together to share the story, to hear more of our history, like the history that doesn't always make it into the books. And then to have discussions from there, to go from there, really get to know each other around this particular event.
So I actually didn't know anything about Juneteenth until I was 25 years old, and I moved to Texas to go to school for a year. And as soon as I got there were people talking about Juneteenth, and I was, what are you talking about? And they were like, this is a celebration of our freedom. And I was like, I never heard of this, because I grew up in Oak Park, and this was never something that was discussed, never brought up in any history class, nowhere.
Sadly enough, my personal relationship with Juneteenth was taught to me through Dr. Maya Angelou. In some of her readings in college, it really became clear to me that there were thousands and thousands of people who were still enslaved during the time after Abraham Lincoln had released the Emancipation Proclamation. 2 years had gone by and people were still enslaved in the state of Texas. I could not believe what I was reading, and that's when I first became informed of Juneteenth.
For me, Juneteenth is an interesting topic because I actually grew up in Texas, Dallas to be specific. And while we talked about it a little bit in school, growing up, I never really made the connection of the gravity of what the holiday really recognizes and celebrates. And it's something that I've come to learn a bit more about as an adult. But knowing that it actually took 2 years for slavery to be fully abolished in the state of Texas after the Emancipation Proclamation is, honestly, it's something that is really terrible to know as a Texan, and affects the way that I feel about Texas in some parts. So my relationship with Juneteenth, though I've not been personally affected by it, it does frame the way that I feel about where I grew up.
You know, it's funny because Juneteenth is something that I grew up with. As I was telling our daughter as we were driving over, I was attending Juneteenth festivals as a child with my grandmother. And remembering that was a big deal to her, that we were going to go, and we were going every day of Juneteenth, we went to Juneteenth. And this is in Buffalo, New York, where I believe it's noted as having the largest Juneteenth festival in the United States. So growing up, I've always attended Juneteenth festivals. So when we moved to Chicago and coming then to Forest Park, we didn't necessarily see the same kind of energy placed in a Juneteenth festival. And so my children didn't really grow up with the same kind of vigor of a Juneteenth that I grew up with. And then there was this push for the pool parties that was happening in the evening for Juneteenth. And our daughter began as a triathlete, and swimming was a thing for her, and she was active in the Park District. So we absolutely made a point to attend, and we were very excited to be a part of it and to see that there was a conversation even happening to sort of help cultivate children into understanding that there is this thing related to our independence that's not connected to the 4th of July.
While some grew up celebrating Juneteenth and others didn't learn about it until later in life, all agreed that making it a national holiday would be good for America as a whole, especially now when the need for healing is at an all-time high.
Juneteenth is currently a state holiday in the state of Illinois, and it's celebrated on the third Monday of each June. And it is important that we have a national recognition of Juneteenth. It is not just about the Civil War. It is not just about Texas. It is not just about African Americans. It's about all of us. And we need to stop our daily activities and coalesce and remember that as a people, as a nation, we have an obligation to pass the baton of American spirit and independence and equality on to the next generations.
Juneteenth as a national holiday would be very, very helpful for our history, for our young people. And I'm hoping and knowing that a national holiday could bring more attention and awareness to Black people all across the world, and making sure that we celebrate it, that we acknowledge it, that we embrace our people.
It's a time for us to educate, not just the Black culture, but all cultures. We want to embrace the holiday like we do the 4th of July because it's a significant part of history. It's our history. And when we do these types of, when we educate our community on what Juneteenth is for us, it's us embracing our freedom. we became free 155 years ago, and in 2020, we still don't see the freedom or the fairism that takes place in America. So it's time for us to stand up, fight for our rights of being free, and start challenging the things that need to take place to change our communities.
I think the nationalization of Juneteenth and making it a national holiday would be an immense thing for the understanding of the role that African Americans played in the building of this country. We built this country. We were brought to this country against our wills to be the free labor for these corporations that are still thriving 400 years later. And so by making this a holiday and annually bringing attention to why it exists, what it means for African Americans in this country, it would be an immense understanding of what we are to this country.
Celebrating Juneteenth is celebrating the history of this country. Black folks have been a part of every single major moment in America's history, from the American Revolution to the Civil War, and every war after that, every major invention, every major opportunity that this country has been able to experience is directly tied to the pain, the struggle, and the hope, and the promise for Black liberation.
It's ironic to me that even in our communities in Bellwood, Maywood, Broadview, that we have kids that are going through school that have never really sit down and talk to a Black mayor, or never sit down and talk to a Black state rep or a Black senator, and not even know that there's an avenue to get there. So if Juneteenth was made a holiday and got national recognition, more people would sit down and learn about it in the classroom. It would be in the national media more, it would be on TV more. It's similar to Martin Luther King. Before it became a holiday, people just knew that there was a young man fighting for civil rights. But now, since it's a national holiday, everybody sits down and they honor that, and I think that would be better for us in our communities.
Again, it's history. This is not just African American history. It's just not Black people history. This is U.S. history. It should be taught worldwide, because again, you need to know the past to be able to correct it. We're not starting from scratch. There's a lot of things that happen in the world, and you mentioned the dominant culture. They need to be aware of what their ancestors part that they played. We need to be aware of what our ancestors played, so we can look to the future and not make those mistakes, and hopefully get out there to make it equal for everyone to live in this country and to be able to thrive, not just live here. I don't want to just live. I want to be able to thrive and have my children thrive, grandchildren on down the line.
I think it's important because oftentimes we don't see these things talked about in the history books. They need to be updated, quite frankly. And so to have a holiday like this, it causes white people to have to understand America's ugly and prevalent past and how it still affects our society and Black people and just minorities today. For Black people, for Black teenagers, it needs to be talked about because oftentimes we don't see ourselves being represented in the media, and to have a big holiday like Juneteenth, it would just be great for people who aren't self-aware and for some who are self-hating to really just have this sense of community in themselves.
Recognizing the end of slavery on the ground in 1865 is tremendously important. I also feel that it's very different from the day of the Emancipation Proclamation in 1863. That was while it was the right thing to do, it was a military tactic. It only applied to areas in the Confederacy where the Union forces, the Union Army, had no functional control. So on the ground, it changed nothing. So I think we need to properly celebrate the day that slavery was formally and forever abolished in the United States.
The history of African American people did not start July 4th. It started with freedom. We were not slaves. We were not property. We were human beings, and the situation of slavery is not the whole of our existence. And so to start
from a place of freedom, to start from a place of restoration, is important that we set our own narrative and say what we will celebrate and who we are. It's important to control our own narrative, and this Juneteenth is a part of that narrative.
Conversations about Juneteenth forces us all to revisit an ugly past and to consider how that past is still affecting us all today. It also, however, prompts us to envision healing and restoration, and that inspires hope and frees us to reimagine the tomorrow that we all still dream of and long for.
When we celebrate, we show up. And showing up is essential right now. Showing up with differences, diversity, commonalities, and a shared goal of hope, healing. And when people come together in celebration, a lot of people's defenses are slightly lessened and our hearts are opened. And when our hearts are open, our ears are open, and meaningful change is possible and contagious and inevitable. And so while the last several weeks and years have been excruciating and challenging and tense, full of grief and rage, it's what we're also seeing as a budding optimism and hope and belief that meaningful change is not only possible, but there's a groundswell of people in the past that might not have had the courage or the words, or the courage to not have the words of how to move forward. And so the healing, to have the courage to have a healing with celebration is very exciting.
And with all the things that's going on in our world now, nationally, with noticing that we are a group of people that can get along, we can see ourselves as a community and as a different races and cultures, that we can come together by praying together in our own way, by socializing together in our own way, and just make sure that we are showing love towards each other, not just only spiritually love, and in every way that understand that we all can be educated, can understand, and we all working for the same goal, and that's love for Christ, and that's where we're staying here. And I think that change is here. I see it in my heart. I feel it. I see it in my church. I see it in the other churches that we deal with, that we just don't want one color in our churches. We want a multicultural church where everyone can get together and be and enjoy the Lord together.
You know, the Black plight in America has been tough. And although we're not enslaved with a slave master, a lot of our mentality based on the socioeconomic position that we're in still has an overarching tone or paradigm of just survival. And, you know, it's important that we know our history, because when we put it in perspective, you know, it'll empower our people to understand where we've come from and what little to nothing that we had. And so if we understand that history and we recognize what little to nothing that we have now and what our obligation is to the revolution to continue to go forward. And I think that's why Juneteenth is important, that we celebrate such a landmark in our time, because it allows us to reminisce on that, but then to also get power out of that, to get fuel to survive through the next day, to survive through the next week, and to use that as power to go forward.
Just keep thinking about the fact that I am my ancestors' wildest dreams. So the enslaved Africans, their hope was for emancipation. And from that point of emancipation, they wanted full access and to be treated like human beings, to have the right to vote, to have the same type of education, to be able to take care of their families. And we've seen over time that we've made progress as a people. We see moments in time in our history, American history, where we've struggled and we've fought as a people and with our allies to gain more freedom, more liberation. And we're not there yet. And so today, that same hope that the enslaved Africans had for emancipation, that post-emancipation that our people had to have the right to vote and to live and to work in this country. It's the same hope that I have today for my children, that beyond today, that they get greater access to equal treatment and to be seen as human beings, to be able to have access to the education and the resources that they need to be successful. And so today, Juneteenth is about that hope of that expectation of an expected end. And as a people and as a nation, we should expect that everybody, no matter the color of their skin, is judged by the content of their character, and that should give us all hope.
Thinking about Juneteenth makes me know and make me believe there's hope, and out of hope, you will get freedom.
You know, hope makes me think of, what will tomorrow look like for our children and our grandchildren, and it would be my hope that it's a place where everybody can be included, where everybody can make the most of their talents and abilities, and that they can live in peace with one another, and that everybody can contribute from society and just be able to live in peace.
When I think of hope, I think of change, and that the people who don't believe will. When I think of Juneteenth, I think of the celebration of equal treatment.
When I think of Juneteenth, I think of happiness and joy. When I think of hope, I think of what's next to come.
When I think of hope, I think of people who believe anyone can do anything. When I think of Juneteenth, I think of people coming together and celebrating.
When I think of Juneteenth, I think of our history. When I think of hope, I think of what's next to come.
When I think of Juneteenth, I think of people coming together to celebrate. When I think of hope, I think people realizing that there is a possibility things can get better.
When I think of Juneteenth, I think of freedom. When I think of hope, I think of not giving up.
When I think of hope, I think of a future where everyone will be treated equal and the world will be a place of harmony. When I think of Juneteenth, I think of cookouts and people coming together to celebrate and remembering our past.